welcome back to the RP Book Club. I'm so excited for you to hear this episode. I had an amazing chat with Walter Goodwater about his latest novel, The Lyre of Red Valley, which is an intriguing, absorbing American Gothic take on a fantasy horror. And I think you folks are hopefully really going to enjoy it. As always, it's your monthly reminder to make sure you sign up to the newsletter and subscribed via your favorite podcast service to be notified when a new episode drops and to get your monthly discount code, which you can use to get 20% off each month's book club book. This month, your code is SBC-21-LRV. This month, you can use that code to get 20% off the ebook, as always, the hardcover, and as an extra special treat, the signed sprayed edge limited edition hardback, which is completely gorgeous. But those beauties are limited to 75 copies, so make sure you go ahead and grab one before they sell out. As always, we would love to hear your thoughts on the show, so tweet us at Rebellion Pub or email in. Now, I owe you a correction. I know last time I said there was a dot in the middle of the email. There actually isn't, so apologies for that, and apologies if you tried to get in touch and couldn't. The correct email to send your thoughts and author questions into is publishingpress@rebellion.co.uk. Walter Goodwater is a writer, fencer, software developer, and dad. He's the author of the Cold War Magic series, the latest book of which was nominated for a Dragon Award, and his work has appeared on Tor.com, Barnes & Noble, and Crime Reads. His newest book, The Lyre of Red Valley, that we're here to talk about today, and I am completely obsessed with, having read it now 5 times, I want to say 5, is a story of magic, monsters, and secrets in small-town California, much like the one he grew up in. Welcome to the RP Book Club. I'm so excited you're here.
Yeah, so happy to be here.
First off, I'm going to ask about the fencing. Tell me about the fencing. Let's start with something. Let's just lead in.
Yeah, certainly is the most interesting part of my bio. So I had no experience with it as a kid. Just it didn't happen in small town California.
Mm-hmm. I was going to say it's an unusual one.
Yeah, but I went away to college, and the college I went to had a pretty decent fencing team, and they actually had a PE class, a physical education class that you could take for one credit. And so I'm like, I'll take 1 credit and learn how to stab people with swords, and that led to a 16-year experience with the sport ever since.
Wow.
So got a little obsessed. Enjoyed it just immensely. It's a great physical activity, but it's also a great mental one as well. So I did it all through school. When I graduated, I helped coach the school, the university club afterwards, and then I kept competing as an individual, but also doing coaching. I coached, there was a boarding school in our area that wanted a fencing coach, and fencing is a very boarding school type of thing for middle school and high school students. So the school, they told me that this is on the West Coast, this is in California, and that we're competing with the boarding schools on the East Coast, and all the boarding schools on the East Coast all have fencing teams. So we need a fencing team. Will you come be our fencing coach? And so I did that for a number of years as well. I've got 2 young kids now, so I've kind of had to scale back a little bit on the extracurriculars. So I haven't picked up a foil in a little while, but I'm sure I'll get back to it once the kids are a little older. But yeah, love the sport.
Maybe get them into it.
Yeah, I used to, when I was coaching younger kids, we took like a foam noodle that you'd use in the pool, and we cut it off and let them stab each other with that. So we recently broke those out because we were watching fencing at the Olympics, and so the kids wanted to try it. So they got a few more years before they've got the coordination to meet my exacting standards as a coach, but it'll be a lot of fun, and it's a great sport. So I encourage anyone who's interested to try it. COVID has not been great for the fencing community.
Of course.
I remember seeing some little thing where they were trying to pitch it as like, oh, look, here's a sport where you already wear a mask. Turns out it's a mesh mask and doesn't really stop germs or anything.
Yeah, not that kind of mask.
Exactly. So that's a little bit of false advertising, but as these types of things come back and we're able to do those activities again, it's an amazing sport. I love it. And if you like bruises, it's also a great sport because you can feel like you really earned your practice time.
I feel like I should try it. I'm constantly covered in like random bruises that I have no idea where they came from. So at least I'd know why I had
Exactly.
them.
Right. You could blame yourself. You're like you didn't parry fast enough.
Oh, exactly. We had fencing at the school I went to for like secondary school, for high school. Um and I tried it once and I was not sufficiently coordinated to do it well at all. So I'm deeply impressed by ability to do it.
Well, I will say that having coached many people from that first moment, no one is coordinated in that way at first because fencing is a kind of a reconfiguration of the way your body works. I've
Hmm.
seen people who are exceptional athletes. I'm like, okay, here's how you fence, and they look ridiculous because everyone looks ridiculous to start. But you'll work some new muscles and some new parts of your brain, and it's a ton of fun.
Amazing. Speaking of picking things up when you're younger, how long have you been writing? Tell us a little about how you got started.
Yeah, I feel like this has been sort of a lifetime obsession. The first time I really remember doing it was back, I think I was probably 8 or 9, and I watched some kids show where they did some sort of pastiche of like those old hard-boiled detective noir stories where
Oh yeah.
the guy's sitting in the office and the lady comes and the femme fatale comes in. And I had no context for any of that, but I thought that looked fun. And so I decided to write my first mystery. And I sat down at our computer. I don't remember what it was, but it was the type of computer that didn't even have color. It was just a black screen with like orange text, and it had like two games and a word processor. And I started typing my first story. Had no idea what the mystery was. I think I only really wrote that one scene where the lady comes in and tells the detective she needs something to look into it. But I was kind of hooked from there on out. So even from then, I was writing, off and on. But as a kid, I loved the idea of writing, but didn't have the discipline to, write.
Hmm.
But I also, at the same time, never really aspired to write short fiction, which would have been a great outlet when you're young and you don't have
Yeah.
necessarily a long attention span. But for some reason, it was always books. Like I wanted to be a novelist, and so I had a number of books that started and never finished, and that pattern sort of continued until college, and unfortunately, college was a bit tough. I went to school to study computer science.
Hmm.
Uh, though I had the aspirations of being a novelist, I had the practical perception of the business side of that and wanted to have a fallback plan. It turns out being a software developer is a decent fallback plan. So that kind of got put on hold. But when I graduated and got a job and realized I didn't have to do homework anymore, suddenly like I had time, and it was remarkable. I just remember being astonished by that. So at that point, I'm like, let's do it. Let's see what I can do. And I've been trying to get published ever since. So that's a sense on timeline. On a sense of actual completed manuscripts, I think I counted, and Liar of Red Valley, I think, is number 15 of
Oh
manuscripts I've written.
wow.
Um, of those, you can see in my in my biography. Not many of them are not published. We've this It's my third published novel, but 15th manuscript. So been doing it a long time. Love it, even when it is frustrating. But it's been fun, and I suppose I'll keep doing it.
Yeah, I hope so. I hope so. This leads us actually really nicely to an early listener question. And we got this question maybe 3 times. So people are really keen. They would like to know if you have any plans for a sequel, prequel, or spin off, or more stories in this world. And particularly, one person who was very keen to know was my partner, who usually never reads. And I read Liar and I thrust it at him and went, "You have to read this." And he read it in one sitting. So he really wants
Wow.
to know if there's more.
That's great. So I did not write it with the intention of starting a series. You know, Sometimes when you write books with a really distinct setting, like you want to
Hmm.
build a lot of the world and imply a lot of extra things going on, but you don't actually want to tell those stories because when you tell all the stories, then it kind of removes a bit of the mystique. So there will be plenty of mysteries and things that I even hint at in the book that I have no intention of ever explaining because I think that kind of takes away. That being said, like I love the setting, I love the world, and honestly, I love a lot of the side characters. And so I would love to write additional stuff in the world, and it's just waiting on the inspiration to kind of break it out. I
Hmm.
do. Not to play favorites, but you do it a little bit. My favorite side characters in the book are these two. these two men who lived in Red Valley, but way back at the beginning, and then they discovered a bit of a loophole in the way the world works and the way magic kind of infused the area of Red Valley. And they didn't much care for the way Red Valley was, so they decided to jump out of time and pop in and out through history inside this house, this Victorian house. This is and to see if things got better, to see if there was a better world ahead of them. This is Thomas and Charles in the Grey House, and I would love to write their story.
Oh yeah.
And I think that that would be a lot of fun. It's both just what they experienced and then what they chose to do is pretty crazy. And I've got the title for it, but I need to figure out some more of the plot, and we'll see if there's demand. You know, I'd love to tell more in this world.
Well, I'm hopeful. I love that. As soon as you said it, I was like, I know who these side characters are. I have two favorites. I know. I'm with you. Like, I know who they are.
Uh-huh.
And that's something really that's throughout the book, that there's kind of this magic and monsters and magic, and it's just accepted in this town, right? It's just that's just how it is, and nobody really. There's this house that jumps in and out of time, and there, people go see it on like field trips.
Right.
It's like that's just how this town is. And I was
Yeah.
thinking about the inspiration for that, and so as we said at the beginning in the bio, you grew up in small town California. I'm just guessing the inspiration for this town came from there, and could you imagine that there actually being this undercurrent of magic in a town like that?
Yeah, certainly that is the inspiration. You know, I wanted to kind of draw my own experience a bit, and you know, just realize that when people think of California, they're not necessarily thinking of the whole state. It's a big place, lots of unique little nooks, and there's in Northern California, it's a bit more rural than people realize, and so I thought there was an interesting setting there, but needed to. I mean, basically everything that I write is going to be something plus magic, something plus monsters, something plus something more. And so that's where the inspiration came from. It's like, what would my town be like if it had these things going on? And one of the things that I came to very quickly on that was I didn't want it to be a town where the magic and the monsters were sort of a secret, or sort of like this is what it is, but no one really knows about it. I thought it was much more interesting to be like this is what it is, and honestly, people are mostly the same. I think that
Mm.
maybe that's pessimism, maybe it's optimism, but I think in general, people don't change much regardless of how the world moves around them. People are the way they are. Small towns are the way they are. They have their prejudices, they have um, their limited perspectives, and they also have their community. And so I kind of wanted to tie all that in and say something about people and about small towns, but also have magic and monsters because everyone loves magic and monsters too.
Oh yeah. Yeah, completely, completely. And that small town setting, it really provides like it's the perfect creepy backdrop, right? And for anyone who did grow up in a kind of small town, or you know, or somewhere like that, you can just picture it. You really have that sense that it's this kind of creepy undercurrent that works really well. And I was thinking also about the pace of the story. So to begin with, it's kind of a little bit slower and kind of draws you in that sort of matching that kind of tone that you get from the small town. And then I felt like we accelerated as we went along, almost as the town was kind of unraveling. Like Sadie was pulling at a thread,
Mhm.
and it just kept coming. Was that a deliberate choice that you wanted to make with the pacing?
Yeah, definitely. I'm glad that that comes across. You want to be immersed in the setting to start. You want to feel like what the town is like, and what small towns are really good at is just sitting in their own inertia. Things don't change much in small towns.
Mm.
You know, people don't move that far from where they grew up, or you know, the high school that I went to. I recently was looking at the faculty list, and you know, as part of the research for the book, and I saw two things. One, the names of the people, the teachers who were there when I was in high school, and two, the names of the people I went to high school with who are now teachers there. So I wanted the town to feel like there's definitely things changing in Red Valley. There's definitely some things going on where things are a little bit worse than they had been, which is important for kind of a
Mm.
a thriller type setting. But in general, the town doesn't change much until it's forced to change. And sometimes these small towns are forced to change in real life or in the speculative world of fiction, where things that they either secrets that have been avoided for a long time or just the progress of civilization makes change happen. When change happens, it can be cataclysmic, and that's sort of where we're going at with Red Valley. There's longstanding rules, there's longstanding truces, and that suddenly start getting broken. And once those rules get broken, the things the town is built on no longer support it. And we see that all the way through with what happens to the people and also just what happens to the town itself. Red Valley's in a rough state by the end of the book. But
Yeah,
that's what happens
definitely.
when you resist change for so long, and then change
Mm.
forces itself along you.
I have another reader question. Um, I have a funny reader question and then like an actual reader question. So their first question was, Walter, are you my favorite new horror author? Spoiler alert, the answer is yes. Which was maybe
Uh,
my favorite that we've had.
that's wonderful. And I concur. Yes, I am definitely your favorite new horror author.
Oh, completely. Yes. Um, and then they wanted to ask about what the inspiration for the magic in the world was.
So, like I said, I started with the setting and then imagined what would be interesting ways of tweaking that world with magic, because that's basically what magic does in a fantasy setting, especially when you're taking like a contemporary setting and then infusing, the supernatural slash fantastical into it. And so, one of the things that I wanted to get away from, just because I didn't feel like it worked well in the setting, is the kind of magic which is, basically people shooting lasers out of their hands, like
Mm,
fireballs and all of that. Like that magic like that has a place, but that wasn't what I felt like what would work in a town like Red Valley. Like it was just that was uh, too overt. It wasn't the kind of magic that I was
mm,
imagining in my small little creepy town. And so the magic works differently for a lot of different people in the town. Let's start with the liar, for example. Um, the liar's magic allows her to create a new reality for people at a cost. And that comes directly from my own observations of people in small towns. And I guess I should take a disclaimer. I'm talking about my experience in small towns. I'm sure there are many lovely small towns out there. I actually live in a different one now that is very lovely. And maybe some of my own perspective on my own small town was also that I was there as a child and a teenager, and that has a skewed perspective. So I don't mean to talk too much crap on small towns. That being said, I will talk a little more crap on small towns, where certain people in small towns can have a skewed view of the way the world actually is. And what's interesting about that is, in the small town, if that's not challenged, that perception is really reality. Like if they think this is the way the world is and no one corrects them, or they're not interested
mm,
in being corrected, then reality for them shifts. And so for me, that is literally where the idea of the liar came from. Is like, well, what if that person that could actually effectuate their own delusion, and then do it for others? And so that's where the idea of the liar's magic comes from. But there are other people have different reflections of magic in the town. Like for example, I mentioned the Thomas and Charles in the Gray House. Like for them, they found magic and decided and channeled it in a way that helped them escape what they saw as the constraints of their time. And so in a lot of ways, magic becomes this tool and it reflected through the people. And so I was thinking like, okay, what would the people in a small town want, and then how can I make the magic work? And then at the same time, you've also got a lot of what we would, what we've been calling monsters, where they're not necessarily magical powers, but they are different types of creatures. And in Red Valley, a lot of them are, they kind of basically try to pass as human, where they're kind of living on the fringes, but secretly, if you looked at them a little closely, you would see things start to shift and and smear a little bit, and you realize there's something not quite right about that. And for me, like I think that also speaks to a lot of the the ugliness that can kind of go along around these sort of communities, and what's tolerated and what sort of happens, and sort of that blending there at the border, and
mm.
how that works out.
That's so true. It's so true. What was your favorite part of the book to write?
Oh, good question. In general, I really liked writing this book. Sometimes I will admit that there have been parts of various books that are a bit of a slog, and it's
Mm,
like, okay, well, I know I got to get through this, and I'll fix it in editing, but it's just painful. But in general, I really enjoyed Red Valley, and I think a lot of it was because I could picture all the settings so clearly because it was literally
mm,
where I lived. But the part that I am fondest of in the book, and I'll try not to, yeah, I don't think it's much of a spoiler, but at some point later on in the book, Sadie's trying to figure out how to use her gift as the liar that she's inherited from her mom, and she has no information about it. She's never done it. Her mom did not prepare her for the world of being the liar, and so she decides the way she's going to figure it out is by making running a sale on the liar's gift and getting a bunch of people through and writing a bunch of lies so she can be like, oh, okay, this is how this magic works. And so she goes to the local diner, stands up on the counter and says, hey, look, for the next few hours I'm going to be over in the corner. If you want a lie told, like $10 is all you need. Right, and then the owner of the diner makes sure that people that's with a proof of purchase, so they got to buy something too. And I did this is another side note. I did work in this diner as a kid as a dishwasher, so that place is also like really indelible in my mind. The smells and everything. So I really liked. I thought that was just a very fun way of talking about this magic, but in sort of this way of making it very real and very,
mm.
she is treating it like a commodity in some ways. But the part I like the most is the first lie that she ends up telling. Um, a woman sits down in front of her, and in my mind, in my outline, I had a different lie in mind. It was going to be a
Oh,
much more,
really?
yeah, it was going to be a very superficial lie. In the book,
Hmm.
some people, it talks about some people wanting to like basically fix a receding hairline, like those sort of really trivial, banal things. And for me, I like that image of people saying, here's this supernatural power, and I'm using it to just be a little bit like more vain. And to me, that said something about people and the way treat
Mm,
we treat interesting things. And so I started writing it that way, and I'm like, well, this feels a little mean. Like it was a woman character sitting down, and I was thinking like, okay, maybe she fixes her wrinkles or whatever. I'm like, no, 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 this is shallow. This is mean. This is not what would, like, Sadie wouldn't take much away from this. And so what the woman wants, and this is the part. It's not really a spoiler, but I'll if you are totally spoiler averse, I'm going to mention a
yeah.
little bit of what she wants for the lie. But um, the woman lost a child, and it happened years ago, and she has tried to get over it. She's tried to move beyond it. Her family has moved beyond it. It's been enough time that they've been able to grieve and move on, but she can't. She just can't move on. And so she asks the liar to tell a lie that she never had a son. And that doesn't, there's throughout the book, there's a question about what the liar's gift is really doing. Is it really modifying reality, or is it just making it seem like it
Mm,
modifies reality? But the woman doesn't care. All she cares is that when she walks out of the diner, she won't remember that anymore. And that just felt like such a tragic moment, where like not only had she experienced the loss of her child, but then she's now, in order for her to move forward, she has to receive this, or go through the second loss, which is removing it from her life. And so I felt like that really spoke to what the liar's gift could do, and also really impacts Sadie as like, oh, I'm doing this sort of fun thing over here, and I thought people were gonna ask me to make them a little skinnier, but in fact, like, this gift can be used to really affect people, and for better or worse. She doesn't know if it was a good thing that she told this lie.
mm,
She just knows that the woman asked for this, and her job is to write the lie down in in a ledger, take a drop of blood, and let the lie do its thing. So that's probably my favorite scene of the book.
mm. And it's so true to what grief is like. I think, that it can feel that painful and that difficult to deal with that you just want it to be gone. You just want it to be gone, whatever that takes. So I found that really poignant when I came to that. And it definitely grounds you, I think, more in what exactly Sadie is dealing with and what she has to live with this power. Um,
Yeah, there's certainly the cost. The book talks a lot about the people who want to tell the lies. Basically, you write a book, your lie in the liar's ledger, and you put blood there. You lose some time at the end of your life. Like, that's the what's called the liar's price. But I also wanted to talk about what it costs to be the keeper of those lies, to have people expose like some of their like their most vulnerable and painful
Mm.
moments to you, and realize that in some ways you're now culpable in that. And so Sadie kind of has to live with the idea of like, well, I did this for this person, she wanted it, but I don't know if either one of us made the right choice. And to speak to that, the cost of her to herself to being the liar as opposed to the people who are asking for the lies.
Mm. Completely.
I hope it says something true about grief, but not trivial about grief. It's
Mm.
always the interesting line you tread when you try to tell a fantastical story, or and I'm sure on the science fiction side as well, where you aspire to tell a story about that's true about people, true about humanity, in a setting that can feel flippant because it's like, oh, well, it's got
Mm.
magic, it's got monsters, it's got spaceships, but like I think most of that, I think obviously the best writers and the really keen readers know that there's nothing flippant about, telling a world with magic. It's just a way of sort of twisting the story a little bit so you can see it from a different perspective, but hopefully it shines that same light on something real about what we all experience, and grief is one of those things.
Let's go for writing advice. If you have writing advice, what advice would you give to any listeners who want to start writing, particularly if they're also working it around a day job?
Yeah. Say goodbye to sleep. That's the best answer I can give you. And I say that as someone working a day job and with two small kids. Like there's only
Oh,
so much.
wow, yeah.
Yeah, there's no time in the day, but you have to want it enough that you find the time, and usually that comes out of sleep, because there's just so much that goes on in your life, and I don't think a long-term like writing practice can exist if it's not sustainable. And the way you make it not sustainable is by abandoning the things that are important in your life, like exercise, like cleaning your house, like being a dedicated friend, parent, spouse. All those things, you need to keep those going because otherwise the wheels are going to fall off. And writing, whether you're writing a book or you're writing for a career, those are both long investments. Like the books take the weeks are not going to get any shorter, and if you want to do this for the long term, you'll be in it a long time. So taking care of yourself while you're doing it is a really important thing to not miss out on. It will slow down your writing, and that's okay. So, and the other thing that I would just say that for me, and I'm feeling this probably most, now with the kids, and less so when I was writing when I was just out of college, is releasing the pressure to get it right the first time. Um,
Mm.
and editing and revisions are always going to be important, but even more so when the time is limited, where I'm sure this is common advice, and I'll just be adding to the chorus here, but you can't edit something you haven't written. You can't fix something that's still stuck in your head. Like, get the words down on the page, and then once you've gotten to a point where you've got enough of them down, then sure, you'll need to go back and revise, and you need to go back and edit, and that will be an additional activity. But it's important, and if you can get paralyzed by trying to think too much ahead of time, whereas I think they're separating those two disciplines, the writing and the editing, I think is really well. I'll say this: it works for me,
Mm.
where I try to get it down, and then I'll come back to it later with my editor's brain, and that's the only way I can make it function. There are times, even just this week, where I was writing something and I was stuck, and I just sat there and I realized I only had about 30 minutes to write before I was going to crash on the couch, and I spent 20 minutes of it just sitting there thinking, and I hadn't really come up with any great answers. And so I'm like, well, I used all this writing time to think, and now I didn't do anything, it was kind of a waste. And so what I've learned to do is spend my thinking time outside of the writing time. So for example,
Mm-hmm.
when I'm in the shower, when I'm driving to the kids to school, that sort of thing, I try to think then, and then when it comes time to write, I just write. And sometimes I'm like, ooh, well, that's a problem for future Walter. He's going to have to come back and fix this. That doesn't work. But future Walter and I have that arrangement, and I think that's really the only way to make it work when you've got such limited time and such like really clear buckets of time where you this is not a writing time because the kids are awake, and that's not conducive for creativity. And so that's what works for me.
Yeah, completely. I totally agree about having separate thinking time and writing time. Um, I'm working on some stuff at the moment, and I did exactly the same thing earlier this week. I just sat there. I had an hour, and I sat there for 35 minutes, staring at the wall and trying to think my way out of something. Yeah, and it's no good. So separate thinking and writing time, completely agree.
Yeah, and for me, the thinking, it not only the separation seems to help, but also the act of doing something else at the same time seems to be really effective. Like for me, walking is always a great way for me to stimulate my, my creative process, whether I'm, pushing the kids around the block in a stroller or, walking from the bus stop or whatever I'm doing, like just the act of doing that really it's so funny how many times I'm like, I cannot figure out this plot point, and then I just go for a walk. I'm like, oh, well, it's so obvious. Like halfway through the walk, it's just there. And I don't know if that's and it's the same thing. Like I said, like when I'm cooking dinner or taking a shower, like
Mm.
if that my body is somehow occupied, my brain can kind of switch on and do other things. Whereas opposed to if you sit and stare at a blinking cursor on a computer screen,
Yeah.
that is antithetical to creative process, and will end up just making you frustrated and even more tired.
Yeah, completely, completely. Did you find any sort of big differences writing this as opposed to other books you've written?
So the biggest difference was just, like I mentioned, the setting, like the fact
Mm-hmm.
that I didn't have to do research. My last two books, one was set in 1950s Berlin, and one was set in like late 50s, early 60s Havana. Neither times nor places I have ever been to, and so I try to set a high bar for research and try to,
Mm-hmm.
really immerse myself in that. And so the research phase of the outlining was much harder there. Whereas this, I literally called up my sister and my friends from high school. I'm like, hey, let's just remember like all the things we hated about the town we grew up in, and let me just write all that down. And it just really stuck in my brain really well. And so it helped the writing process more so than the others. I will also say that I'm a pretty rigorous outliner. It's always
Mm-hmm.
been a really helpful process for me. But in this book, it did struggle a bit on the outline. And I guess what I should say is I had an outline, but I felt like I needed to deviate from it more. And so I guess I've developed into a bit more of a hybrid model of, having it all planned out ahead of time with letting the story go the way it wants to go. And that was a big shift for me. And then I will also say that I did end up having to rewrite the whole first third of the book after I gave it to my agent, because she said basically like one sentence, and I'm like, oh wow, you are so absolutely right. And it was so frustrating because he couldn't even like I couldn't even argue with her if I wanted to. It was
Yeah.
just so obvious. And that's what's so great about having partners in the writing process, editors, agents, friends, family, who can just see those things you can't see. But yes, it does then require you to go back and do the work. And so more rewriting on this book than in previous ones. So I
Mm-hmm.
guess that speaks to a bit more of a chaotic process, but maybe that's because it was more organic and coming out of my previous experience. I don't know. Regardless, I'm happy with the outcome. And we'll see going forward if it's changed me forever as a writer, if it was sort of a one-off thing, writing about the town that I spent my formative years in.
Yeah, it'll be really interesting to see if you keep that hybrid going, or if you go back to being a strong outliner.
Yeah, I've certainly, I'm working on a new project now, and I started the outline, but I feel well, I started from the outline, and I do feel that that pull away from the outline happening. So it may be that I'm broken forever.
Yeah, I think that's it. I could never really outline to start with, so I was broken from the beginning. Okay, this is a fun one. I ask this pretty much every podcast because it's my favorite thing. Um, was there any particular music you listen to or playlist you listen to while writing? Or if not, can you think of any songs or anything that reminds you of the characters of the book?
Great question. Yeah, I'm a big music while writing guy, which again, that is tough with sharing the house with small children and writing while they're asleep. But headphones are good, and low volume is good. And luckily, the kids' rooms are on the other side of the house from where I write. So all that to be said, I'm really into. Well, I guess I should say this. I cannot write if somebody is singing words. Like if there are
Mm-hmm.
words in the song, then that just is it's a fascinating way of blocking any words coming out of my head. So all instrumental stuff. I'm really drawn to a lot of movie and video game soundtracks for whatever reason. I think a lot of it is because they have like they have moments where it's sort of just background noise, where it's not even really trying to have a hook or anything like that. So that helps, just sort of living in the background. And for this one, yeah, I can think of I will listen to a lot of the soundtracks from a couple of video games, actually. It's interesting when I'm thinking about it. Those main ones being the games Red Dead Redemption and Red Dead Redemption 2, which are Westerns,
Mm-hmm.
which does sort of inspire I mean, the book is not a Western, it is set in the West, but it does sort of have a little bit of that vibe to it. And the soundtracks are just phenomenal for those games.
Oh yeah, they're amazing.
Yeah. And then the other one that I listen to a lot are the soundtracks from a game called The Last of Us and its sequel. A lot of Spanish type guitar in those, and also a lot of atmospheric and a lot of emotion. Because if you've played The Last of Us, The Last of Us 2, like they are very dark and they are very painful. And remembering that from the game and feeling it in the music has certainly helped through some of the tough spots in the book. But yeah, I think those are definitely when I think about. It's funny that I hadn't really thought about it, but I think about the tone of Liar Red Valley. Like I feel like those two games kind of really help set it. So maybe that was intentional, maybe it's not. But I do recommend the soundtracks. They're amazing music, and was really helpful for my process.
Yeah, completely. Those two games, absolutely. Yeah, now you say it, it's completely the vibe. It's completely the
Yeah.
vibe. It's so funny.
Yeah,
It's made it into the book through like osmosis.
that's awesome.
Since we're talking about kind of other cultural, non literary things, were there any influences kind of outside of the literary world that you feel like you brought into the book or that made their way into the book, other than the two games that we just said? I feel like I got a little bit of a Lost Boys vibe when the Laughing Boys were surrounding Sadie's house.
Mhm.
Is that just me?
Um, I don't think that was a direct influence. I've seen that movie once, but it was a long time ago. But as you say it, like, yeah, I can certainly. I don't know. I would say that I don't think I have any like specific cultural influences. That being said, like we were just talking about how the music sort of worked its way in and not intentionally. Like I aspire to like constantly be consuming stories through video games, movies, books, whatever format I can, and I just know that that's what influence like that comes out, hopefully not in a too derivative sort of way. Like that's what we're all trying to take those inspirations and then tweak them and move them. And I'm sure that happened here. I don't know that I have a specific case of a scene or anything like that that comes from a movie or another game, at least intentionally. Like we said, didn't wasn't thinking about The Last of Us, but now that I think about it, it's
Yeah.
like, well, yeah, Sadie's story and what the characters go through in that game are similar. So yeah, I think there's maybe some of that, but in this case, it's going to be subtle and not intentional.
Mm.
But I'm sure it's there. I'm sure it's there.
Are there any books that you would recommend to somebody who's read Liar and loved it?
Mm, that is a good question. Let's see. Well,
I'm bringing out the tough questions now.
yeah, I mean it speaks a little bit to the influence question, and also like just similar books with a similar vibe. Like what vibe was I aspiring for? When I was setting down to write it, I was thinking about what does it mean to like have it set in California, set in America with all this other stuff going on. Like I'm sure I didn't escape the influence of American Gods by Neil Gaiman. Like that was a very seminal book for me when I read it. It was
Mm.
I had grown up reading a lot of fantasy, but more high fantasy, the traditional ones, Tolkien and Terry Brooks and the Dragonlance stuff. Like just devoured all that as a kid, and then it was the year I graduated from college. Like I found American Gods, and it was like, oh, this is what fantasy can be. Like it doesn't have to be stuck in these other settings, and it but you can use real life and or other settings. It doesn't have to be necessarily contemporary. So I feel weird recommending a book quite as popular as that, because it's like, well, I mean, everyone's aware of that book. um, but when I think about the vibe I was trying to set of a dark mirror world of our world, influenced by these forces that are beyond our control, and somebody kind of pulled along into it, that certainly probably was my main touchstone, just because it's such an important work in that
Mhm.
setting.
Yeah, absolutely. If you haven't already read that, then please go and do so immediately. Like, stop listening, go read it, do that first, and then come back because it really is a seminal work. Um, yeah, and one of the key, well, one of my favorite books, the most important ones that I would list on my desert island reads for sure.
Oh
Um,
yeah, yeah. He's it's interesting because when I think I've read everything he's done, and he doesn't have like a set style. Like in American Gods is in a lot of ways like the writing style is a bit of a deviation from some of his other things. It's only doesn't read like Stardust or even Neverwhere. It has a very starkness to it, and
mm,
to the writing, and but even in the same time, like he has a way of creating a world that it just happens so subtly before your eyes. Like I mentioned a while back about how I had stories and mysteries in Red Valley that I created, but I know I'll never tell because it really builds in the richness of the world. And like that is Neil Gaiman. Like that is I got that from him. Like, and American Gods is a great example. There are things in there where you're like I desperately want to know what he's talking about here, but he'll never tell me, and I'm
oh,
okay with
he's
that.
never gonna tell you.
Yeah, because that it's foundational to the world that there are things you don't understand, and so I aspire to do similar things. It's frustrating as a reader, but like it's also really captivating.
Completely. It's for me it feels like that extra element that really immerses you in a world in a way that's hard to achieve otherwise.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's why I guess Anansi Boys is another book in that same world, but really not a sequel. Like I don't ever want to read a sequel to American Gods. I didn't
Mm.
get into the TV show. Like I like what he has in the story, and being left wanting more, but knowing I'm not gonna get it, and being like totally fine with it. Like if I can achieve that in my writing, then I'll be satisfied.
So we have a question from a reader listener, and I think it's we're gonna take this as a light-hearted question because I feel like it could go one way or the other, but we're gonna be light with it.
All right.
Um, they wanted to know, what lie would you tell?
Ooh, okay. Lighthearted.
Yeah,
Uh,
you can see why I had to like preface it with that because I feel
sure.
like it could go either way.
Yes, as previously discussed, there are shallow superficial lies and there are deeper ones. Let's try to pick a shallow superficial one. Well, I'm not going to lie that as a guy in his mid 30s, the receding hairline thing is a real problem that we all really experience. And would I give up years of my life to have? No, that's not true. Like, and
No.
that's the hard part. Is it's like it would be great, but what am I giving up? And the other thing about the liar's price is you never really know what you're giving up. Like you just know you're giving up some. So okay, what would I actually give up some of my life to get? That's a tough one. I mean, I guess that's the whole point of why I made it that way.
Yep.
Yeah, man, I should have been prepared for this question. Would I tell a lie? Would I give up something? I give up some of my life to get some change in the world? Oh man, that is tough.
Mm,
I feel like I wouldn't. Here's the thing. I feel like I wouldn't do it, and it's funny saying that because the whole idea of the liar is that people, when presented with the actual opportunity, people do it. And
mm,
I wrote that feeling like people actually would. And so I wonder if I'm telling a lie right now and imagining like, oh well, I wouldn't do it because it's hypothetical and I don't want to sound shallow on this wonderful podcast. Like, but I have a hard time deciding right now because when I think about what I have to offer, like what's left in my life. And this may sound a little sappy with kids and all that, like it kind of
mm.
changes my perspective. Like all I want to do is be around for as long as I can with them, and just see the world through their eyes. And so would I give up any of that time for something for me? I wouldn't. Would I give up something of that for something for them? Probably.
Yeah.
And so And now, but see, now we're getting out of the fun part of this answer. So I'm
Oh
gonna
no,
go
but
back
it's
to go.
good though.
I'm gonna go back to I'm losing my hair, and I would love to keep that around. And if I had to give up a week, I would give up a week of my life. See, that sounds so horrible and shallow, but I'll say it. I'll give up a week of my life to not lose my hair before I turn 40.
There we go. I was trying to think of when I saw this come in, I've been trying to think about what my answer would be. And then I went down the sappy road too and went like, "Oh, but I have, my life is really great and I'm really happy." and
Uh-huh.
and I'm wondering, like, it's almost a test. It's a test of like how good you've made your life, or like been able to make it. But yeah, no, I couldn't think of anything. I mean, I probably could. Like, if pushed, I could probably come up with something, but yeah.
Right, and it also speaks back to that, like when we don't really have the choice in front of us, but if we did, like would we make a different would we feel
Mm,
different about it? And maybe you could convince yourself that either it would be worth it, or that maybe she won't take that much of my life when I
yeah.
tell this lie. It's just a little lie. And you tell enough little lies, it probably won't matter that much. And so I think we could delude ourselves that way, but right now it feels a little bit too shallow. But maybe we're just not being introspective enough.
Yeah, maybe we really would. I don't know. I really don't know. I'd also, I think I would have had a very different answer even just like a few years ago. I think, especially, and then thinking about like as a teenager,
Yeah,
if you put that choice, oh yeah, 100%. Because you feel like you're magic and you're never going to die and it's going to be worth it. And it doesn't matter how much time.
absolutely. Yeah, I think it does speak to a little bit of what your life experience is and where you are, because yeah, as a kid, your death is completely hypothetical. It's this thing that happens to other people, and like age is not something that matters because you're invincible. But you also have these senses of like, okay, well, I'm like, there are these things about who I am, about how I look, about my friends, about my life, that just feel so much bigger. So absolutely, in a moment like that, where you would feel the need to tell this lie, and who cares about the consequences? And I think people do that a lot and their kids, but then you get a little older and you're like, I just kind of want to hang out for a while. Like, I just want to be here and enjoy this. I don't need to look prettier. I don't need to be skinnier. I just need to be around. So it's an interesting litmus test for how people's values.
Okay, so it's time for our reading, if you're ready.
I suppose I am. Let me see. I have not. I read the stuff out loud when I write it. I have not read it out loud in a long time. And I just heard some of the sample from the audiobook, and
Mm.
so I'm very grateful for the work of professionals in reading. So I will do my best. I will not attempt any voices or anything silly like that. And I'll do my best.
Sounds great.
So at this point in our story, Sadie has been called to the hospital unexpectedly and found that her mom has cancer she never told her about, cancer that she had covered up with one of her lies, and cancer that was so far along that by the time Sadie got there, she was only there for a little while before her mom dies. And so now Sadie is left wondering, what now? The only person in her family is gone, and she is now facing the future without her. And she walks out into the hot summer night of Red Valley into the parking lot, wondering what's next. And then a car pulls into the parking lot. A car slowly drove into the lot, blinding her for a moment with its headlights. It pulled up along the red painted curb and stopped. The nurses looked up, but when they recognized the car, a charcoal 1967 Cadillac lined in chrome, they quickly averted their eyes. It was parked illegally, but in Red Valley, the lies didn't apply to everyone the same. The car's door swung open on creaky hinges. Sadie didn't move. She knew who this was. Everyone in town knew who drove this car. You stood aside when you saw it coming. Out of fear or deference didn't matter as long as you got the hell out of the way. Sadie had seen this car and the others like it plenty of times. cruising slowly down Main Street or Baker Road, passing easily through stop signs and traffic lights, always watching. The driver stepped out. He was a tall, gaunt man with sandy hair. His clothes, a decade or two out of fashion, didn't quite fit right, including a brown leather jacket with a ripped sleeve. Sadie couldn't see his eyes through his large, mirrored sunglasses. Some people in town called men like this mirror eyes, because when you stared at them, all you saw was yourself looking back at you. Everyone in town called them creepy, and never when one could hear you, and you never knew when they could hear. Their official name, if they had such a thing, was the King's Men, and they were the King's voice and ears in Red Valley. You didn't want one of the King's Men looking at you, and you damn sure didn't want one of them talking to you, and you really, really didn't want to get into their car. The King's Man was staring at Sadie. The King offers his sympathies, the King's Man said. His voice was flat, lifeless, like he'd been reading a prepared statement. His hands hung limp at his sides. The two nurses quickly crushed their cigarettes and retreated into the hospital. Excuse me, Sadie said. Sweat was creeping steadily down her spine. The King's Man said nothing at first. Instead, he cocked his head slightly to the side, as if he was listening to something. Then he said, "The King wishes to express that he thought fondly of your mother and mourns her passing." Mom knew the King? The liar's power came from the King, but Sadie had never considered that her mom might actually have met him. Everyone knew of the King, but no one interacted with him. As far as Sadie knew, no one had ever even seen the King, though the effects he had on Red Valley were felt every day. Everything weird in Red Valley had some connection to the King. His presence had seeped into the hills, the forests, and the fields, and had altered the land forever. Thank you, Sadie managed to reply eventually. The liar is a vital part of Red Valley, the King's Man said. It is an essential function. Another car entered the parking lot. Behind the glare, Sadie could see a rack of lights mounted on the roof and a seven-pointed star painted on the door. A sheriff's car. It moved real slow towards the King's Man, almost reluctantly. Well, she's gone now, Sadie said, maybe a little too sharply, considering who she was talking to. She knew she should be afraid and could feel the expected fear down deep in her gut. But every time it started to take over, she pictured her mom's still face, and suddenly there wasn't any room for fear in a head choked with grief and anger. I guess we'll all have to make do. The sheriff's car circled the lot, staying conspicuously far from the hospital entrance. The King's Man raised one of his pale hands and traced the tip of a finger across pale lips. It was a strange foreign gesture, and she wasn't even sure he was aware he was doing it. There's always been a liar in Red Valley. There will always be a liar in Red Valley. There must be. I don't know what you're trying to tell me. Another pause. Your mother had an arrangement with the King. Her mother did too, and her mother, and hers. The King's Man took a step closer, or at least she thought he did, but she didn't see him move. He just suddenly, only a few feet from her, the lights from the inside the hospital glaring back at her from his mirrored eyes. And now, so do you. What? Sadie backed up. I am not the liar. You are, the King's Man said. You will be. The sheriff's car finally pulled up next to the Cadillac and turned on its lights. Pulsing red and blue filled the parking lot and flickered off the King's Man's glasses. A deputy got out of the cruiser and stood there behind the door like it was a barricade. You'll need to move your car, the deputy said. There was a forced strength in his voice, a manufactured bravado. He had one hand on the car door, but Sadie couldn't see the other one. This is a red zone for emergency vehicles only. The King's Man didn't react. He didn't look at the deputy or even acknowledge his arrival. The muscles on his face were slack, his hands limp. Did you hear me? The deputy said, louder now. He moved out from behind the car door, and now Sadie could see his other hand resting on his pistol. I said, move the damn car. The King's Man cocked his head again. Some brief, muted emotion played around his mouth. Surprise? Amusement? Then he turned towards the deputy. You have lived in Red Valley a long time, Deputy Jason Allen Johnson. You were born here, in this very hospital. You grew up here, played Little League, third base, and watched fireworks over the river on the 4th of July. Your family lives here. You have roots in the community, Jason Allen Johnson. The king's man turned his head to stare at the flashing lights for a long moment, then turned back to the deputy. So you know better. The deputy swallowed. His grip tightened on his gun. Things change. Laws get enforced on everybody now, he said shakily. All that swagger had leaked out of his voice by now. Orders of Under Sheriff Hassler. Sadie wanted to move back, move away, get out of any crossfire if this kid had, with a gun, decided to man up and be a hero. But in that moment, her body decided the best thing it could do was not even move a muscle. Laws, the king's man said. The king has been in Red Valley long before your laws. The king was here long before there was a Red Valley, before there were hills, before there was sky. The king has always been here, blessing this land with his presence and bestowing boons upon his faithful. And you would interrupt the king's business over a parking violation. The deputy looked at Sadie for the first time. His hand was still on the gun. Then he looked back at the king's man. His fear was curdling into a newfound resolve, and Sadie cringed. You need to move your car, sir, the deputy commanded, or I will have to arrest you. The following silence thundered in Sadie's ears. She'd left her mother's deathbed only a few minutes ago, and she walked into this? The king's man said nothing. Even after his customary pause, he remained motionless. The lights flashed in his mirrored glasses. The deputy drew his gun. Then the king's man moved. To Sadie, it was just a blur, backlit by blue and red. One moment, the king's man was in front of her, then he was gone, and then he was back. And the deputy was screaming. The deputy's gun was on the blacktop. He held up his hand, what remained of his hand. Blood spattered on the ground, his shoes, his pants. His eyes were white and wide. His skin was already losing color. You'd best go inside, the king's man said, without looking at the deputy, and get that looked at. When he spoke, Sadie could see blood in his teeth, the deputy's blood. Nurses rushed out of the sliding doors at the sound of the screaming. They quickly and quietly ushered the deputy back into the hospital, eyes carefully averted from the king's man and Sadie. The king's man ignored them. The king apologizes for that unfortunate spectacle. Sadie struggled for a moment to get enough moisture on her tongue to reply. Okay, she said. The ledgers, the king's man said. The liar's books. They are yours now. Not just your mother's ledger, but all of them. Others will covet them. With your mother gone, they will come looking for them. They do not respect the sanctity of secrets. They do not understand that some things deserve to be forgotten. Sadie had no idea her mom had other ledgers from her grandmother and her grandmother. They didn't have many books in their little house, magical or otherwise. But where was her mom's ledger? She always had it with her, but Sadie hadn't seen it in the hospital room, though she had been distracted at the time. So all the king asks is that you keep the books safe, the king's man said, and you keep the books secret. Okay, Sadie said again, not trusting her to say anything else. The king values one thing above all other things, the king's man said, loyalty. You can trust me, Sadie said as she tried not to look at the puddle of black blood by the deputy's car. I'll take care of the books. Good. The king's man produced a crisp, white card. Sadie took it. There was a phone number on it, nothing else. For emergencies, he said. Thanks. After a long, weird pause, the king's man said, have a pleasant evening. Then he returned to his car, turned it on with a rumble, and drove slowly away, leaving Sadie alone in the deserted parking lot. No one came out from the hospital. Even the deputy's screams had died away. The only sounds now were the cicada hiss of insects and the distant murmur of traffic on the road. Sadie stared out into the growing dark and realized she had no idea how she was going to get home.
Oh, it's so atmospheric. Thank you so much. That was brilliant.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much again to Walter for joining me on the show. You were a complete delight to have on. And now I'm definitely going to have to go replay the Red Dead series and The Last of Us. Thank you also, of course, to all you wonderful listeners. It's great to have you with us. And I'm really looking forward to hearing what you all thought about Liar. Next month, I'm incredibly excited to be joined by the one and only Derek Kunsken to talk about his latest installment in the Quantum Evolution series, The Quantum War. I hope you all have a great month, and I'll speak to you then.